Making the Commonwealth, 1910 to 1926. As soon as South Africa was united in 1910, the kindergarten returned to London to try to federate the whole empire by the same methods. They were in a hurry to achieve this before the war with Germany, which they believed to be approaching. With Abe Bailey money, they founded the Round Table, under Kerr's, Lothian's, editorship. Met in formal conclaves presided over by Milner to decide the fate of the empire, and recruited new members to their group, chiefly from New College, of which Milner was a fellow. The new recruits included a historian, F.S. Oliver, Sir Alfred Zimmern, Sir Reginald Copeland, Lord Lovat, and Waldorf Lord Astor. Curtis and others were sent around the world to reorganize Round Table groups in the chief British dependencies. For several years, 1910 to 1916, the Round Table groups worked desperately trying to find an acceptable formula for federating the empire. 3 books and many articles emerged from these discussions, but gradually it became clear that federation was not acceptable to the English-speaking dependencies. Gradually, it was decided to dissolve all formal bonds between these dependencies, except perhaps allegiance to the crown, and depend on the common outlook of Englishmen to keep the empire together. This involved changing the name, British Empire, to Commonwealth of Nations, as in the title of Curtis's book of 1916. Giving the chief dependencies, including India and Ireland, their complete independence, but gradually and by free gift rather than under duress, working to bring the United States more closely into this same orientation, and seeking to solidify the intangible links of sentiment by propaganda among financial, educational, and political leaders in each country. Efforts to bring the dependencies into a closer relationship with the mother country were by no means new in 1910, nor were they supported only by the Rhodes-Milner Group. Nevertheless, the actions of this group were all-pervasive. The poor military performance of British forces during the Boer War led to the creation of a commission to investigate the South African War, with Lord Esher Brett as chairman, 1903. Among other items, this commission recommended creation of a permanent committee of imperial defense. Esher became, unofficial, chairman of this committee, holding the position for the rest of his life, 1905 to 1930. He was able to establish an imperial general staff in 1907 and to get a complete reorganization of the military forces of New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa so that they could be incorporated into the imperial forces in an emergency, 1909 to 1912. On the committee itself, he created an able secretariat, which cooperated loyally with the Rhodes-Milner Group thereafter. These men included Sir Maurice, later Lord Hankey, and Sir Ernest Swinton, who invented the tank, 1915. When, in 1916 to 1917, Milner and Esher persuaded the cabinet to create a secretariat for the first time, the task was largely given to this secretariat from the Committee of Imperial Defense. Thus, Hankey was secretary to the committee for 30 years, 1908 to 1938, to the cabinet for 22 years, 1916 to 1938, clerk to the Privy Council for 15 years, 1923 to 1938, Secretary General of the 5 imperial conferences held between 1921 and 1937, Secretary to the British delegation to almost every important international conference held between the Versailles Conference of 1919 and the Lausanne Conference of 1932, and one of the leading advisors to the conservative governments after 1939. Until 1907, the overseas portion of the empire, except India, communicated with the imperial government through the Secretary of State for Colonies. To supplement this relationship, conferences of the prime ministers of the self-governing colonies were held in London to discuss common problems in 1887, 1897, 1902, 1907, 1911, 1917, and 1918. In 1907, it was decided to hold such conferences every 4 years, to call the self-governing colonies dominions, and to bypass the colonial secretary by establishing a new dominion department. Ruskin's influence, among others, could be seen in the emphasis of the Imperial Conference of 1911, that the empire rested on a triple foundation of 1. Rule of law, 2. Local autonomy, and 3. Trusteeship of the interests and fortunes of those fellow subjects who had not yet attained self-government. The Conference of 1915 could not be held because of the war, but as soon as Milner became one of the 4 members of the War Cabinet in 1915, his influence began to be felt everywhere. We have mentioned that he established a cabinet secretariat in 1916 to 1917, consisting of 2 protégés of Escher, Hankey and Swinton, and 2 of his own, his secretaries Leopold Amery and W.G.A. Omsbury-Gore, later Lord Harlech. At the same time, he gave the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, a secretariat from the Round Table consisting of Kerr, Lothian, Grigg, Lord Altrincham, W.G.S. Adams, Fellow of All Souls College, and Astor. He created an Imperial War Cabinet by adding Dominion Prime Ministers, particularly Smuts, to the United Kingdom War Cabinet. He also called the Imperial Conferences of 1917 and 1918 and invited the Dominions to establish resident ministers in London. As the war drew to a close in 1918, Milner took the office of Colonial Secretary, with Amery as his assistant, negotiated an agreement providing independence for Egypt, set up a new self-government constitution in Malta, sent Curtis to India, where he drew up the chief provisions of the Government of India Act of 1919, appointed Curtis to the post of advisor on Irish affairs, where he played an important role in granting Dominion status to Southern Ireland in 1921, gave Canada permission to establish separate diplomatic relations with the United States, the first minister being the son-in-law of Milner's closest collaborator on the Rhodes Trust, and called the Imperial Conference of 1921. During this decade, 1919 to 1929, the Rhodes-Milner Group gave the chief impetus toward transforming the British Empire into the Commonwealth of Nations and launching India on the road to responsible self-government. The creation of the Round Table groups by Milner's kindergarten in 1909 to 1913 opened a new day in both these fields, although the whole group was so secretive that, even today, many close students of the subject are not aware of its significance. These men had formed their intellectual growth at Oxford on Pericles' funeral oration, as described in a book by a member of the group, Sir Alfred Zimmern's The Greek Commonwealth, 1911, on Edmund Burke's On Conciliation with America, on Sir J.B. Seeley's Growth of British Policy, on A.V. Dicey's The Law and Custom of the Constitution, and on the New Testament's Sermon on the Mount. The last was especially influential on Lionel Curtis. He had a fanatical conviction that with the proper spirit and the proper organization, local self-government and federalism, the kingdom of God could be established on earth. He was sure that if people were trusted just a bit beyond what they deserve, they would respond by proving worthy of such trust. As he wrote in The Problem of a Commonwealth, 1916, if political power is granted to the groups before they are fit, they will tend to rise to the need. This was the spirit which Milner's group tried to use toward the Boers in 1902 to 1910, toward India in 1910 to 1947, and unfortunately toward Hitler in 1933 to 1939. This point of view was reflected in Curtis's 3 volumes on world history, published as Civitas Dei in 1938. In the case of Hitler, at least these high ideals led to disaster. This seems also to be the case in South Africa. Whether this group succeeded in transforming the British Empire into a Commonwealth of Nations or merely succeeded in destroying the British Empire is not yet clear, but one seems as likely as the other. That these ideas were not solely those of Curtis, but were held by the group as a whole, will be clear to all who study it. When Lord Lothian died in Washington in 1940, Curtis published a volume of his speeches and included the obituary which Grigg had written for the Round Table. Of Lothian this said, quote, "He held that men should strive to build the kingdom of heaven here upon this earth, and that the leadership in that task must fall first and foremost upon the English-speaking peoples." Unquote. Other attitudes of this influential group can be gathered from some quotations from 4 books published by Curtis in 1916 to 1920. Quote, "The rule of law, as contrasted with the rule of an individual, is the distinguishing mark of the Commonwealth. In despotisms, government rests on the authority of the ruler or on the invisible and uncontrollable power behind him. In a Commonwealth, rulers derive their authority from the law, and the law from a public opinion, which is competent to change it. The idea that the principle of the Commonwealth implies universal suffrage betrays an ignorance of its real nature. That principle simply means that government rests on the duty of its citizens to each other and is to be vested in those who are capable of setting public interests before their own. The task of preparing for freedom the races which cannot yet govern themselves is the supreme duty of those who can. It is this spiritual end for which the Commonwealth exists, and material order is nothing except as a means to it. The peoples of India and Egypt, no less than those of the British Isles and Dominions, must be gradually schooled in the management of their national affairs. The whole effect of the war of 1914 to 1918 has been to bring movements long gathering to a sudden head. Companionship in arms and fanned, long smoldering resentment against the presumption that Europeans are destined to dominate the rest of the world. In every part of Asia and Africa, it is bursting into flames. Personally, I regard this challenge to the long unquestioned claim of the white man to dominate the world as inevitable and wholesome, especially to ourselves. The world is in the throes which precede creation or death. Our whole race has outgrown the merely national state, and, as surely as day follows night, or night the day, will pass either to a commonwealth of nations or else to an empire of slaves. And the issue of these agonies rests with us." Unquote. In this spirit, the Rhodes-Milner Group tried to draw plans for a federation of the British Empire in 1909 to 1916. Gradually, this project was replaced or postponed in favor of the Commonwealth project of free cooperation. Milner seems to have accepted the lesser aim after a meeting sponsored by the Empire Parliamentary Association on July 28, 1916, at which he outlined the project for federation with many references to the writings of Curtis, but found that not one Dominion member present would accept it. At the Imperial Conference of 1917, under his guidance, it was resolved that any readjustment of constitutional relations should be based on full recognition of the Dominions as autonomous nations, of an imperial commonwealth, and of India as an important portion of the same, should recognize the right of the Dominions and India to an adequate voice in foreign policy and in foreign relations, and should provide effective arrangements for continuous consultation in all important matters of common imperial concern. Another resolution called for full representation for India in future imperial conferences. This was done in 1918. At this second wartime imperial conference, it was resolved that prime ministers of dominions could communicate directly with the prime minister of the United Kingdom, and that each dominion and India could establish resident ministers in London who would have seats on the imperial war cabinet. Milner was the chief motivating force in these developments. He hoped that the imperial war cabinet would continue to meet annually after the war, but this did not occur. During these years, 1917 to 1918, a declaration was drawn up, establishing complete independence for the dominions except for allegiance to the crown. This was not issued until 1916. Instead, on July 9, 1919, Milner issued an official statement which said, quote, "The United Kingdom and the Dominions are partner nations, not yet indeed of equal power, but for good in all of equal status. The only possibility of a continuance of the British Empire is on a basis of absolute, out-and-out equal partnership between the United Kingdom and the Dominions. I say that without any kind of reservation whatsoever." Unquote. This point of view was restated in the so-called Balfour Declaration of 1926 and was enacted into law as the Statute of Westminster in 1931. B.K. Long of the South African Roundtable Group, who was colonial editor of The Times in 1913 to 1921 and editor of Rhodes's paper, The Cape Times, in South Africa in 1922 to 1935, tells us that the provisions of the Declaration of 1926 were agreed on in 1917, during the Imperial Conference convocted by Milner. They were formulated by John W. Defoe, editor of the Winnipeg Free Press for 43 years and the most influential journalist in Canada for much of that period. Defoe persuaded the Canadian Prime Minister, Sir Robert Borden, to accept his idea and then brought in Long and Dawson, editor of the Times. Dawson negotiated the agreement with Milner, Smuts, and others. Although Australia and New Zealand were far from satisfied, the influence of Canada and of South Africa carried the agreement. 9 years later, it was issued under Balfour's name at a conference conducted by Amory.